Okay, before we start, I'm still waiting for all people to join us. This is a technical note. I think we are good to go. And good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be part of this discussion, but also improvise to start the moderation of this panel. Unfortunately, Marta has some technical issues and difficulties joining us now, and I'm hoping she will join us later because obviously she can do a better work and than I can do improvising this moderation. I'm very happy to have you here. On behalf of the EPC, I want to thank my co-panelists, and obviously it's always a pleasure to share my panel with Viola von Cramon. It's an outstanding rapporteur. Kosovo couldn't really have a better one in not just showing proactive support, but really being on top of everything that is happening in Kosovo, and there is a lot happening. And obviously, Jan Bancroft, we have been working in other projects which are very, very important for the community in Kosovo and in Serbia. And obviously, I mean, you don't need more presentation because you have been in this for a longer time than, maybe longer than I have been, obviously. There were elections in Kosovo, and at some point we thought that, elections are not news in Western Balkans. Unfortunately, these ones were news, but they were probably the most boring election we have ever had. And not just, because obviously there was a good sign that there were no incidents, because organizing elections in the local elections in the northern part of Kosovo was always an issue that has sparked many debates, even at some point tensions between Kosovo and Serbia. I remember, and we discussed with my co-panelists today, how difficult it was to actually organize them in 2013, in which just, participation of the local Serbs in the public life in Kosovo was already good news. And unfortunately, we had better turnout than we had this Sunday, which is then a very, very negative note to actually start this debate with. We agreed that I would be the first one to speak. For those who have seen me in different panels, I am definitely not a positive person when it comes to these issues. I'm quite a pessimistic person, and obviously very frustrated with how fast things actually can go bad between Kosovo and Serbia, and how difficult it is actually to have some positive, results and steps. So I will start with, my intervention, and please note that Viola has to leave at noon. It means that at 2, sorry, because I'm still with my London time, at 2, and so the time span of her engagement in this panel is slightly shorter. So as for the elections, my input, I have been obviously, as all of you, following closely the events and hoping that the agreement, after the agreement in Ohrid, we are going to have some positive, steps on the ground, meaning that, to form the association, which is, now the most pressing issue between Kosovo and Serbia. You need institutions, right? And I'm not just talking about, the municipalities, but also, for me, my greatest concern is also the fact that Kosovo police is really working with, limited capacities in the northern part of Kosovo, which then brings me a lot of, questions in relation to community policing and human security in the north, and the capacities of the institutions to actually respond to citizens. And this brings me to my key point. What did this election bring to the citizens in the north? It brought them nothing, meaning that we still see that the situation has gone to sort of pre-2012-13 situation, the status quo, the boycott of the local institutions. On paper, Kosovo, for this election for Kosovo was a face-saving exercise, meaning that we really had to do it. There were, constitutional deadlines. We have postponed them once because of the Ohrid, which was, I think, a good step from the government of Kosovo, because it really contained, the situation in the north to maintain this, negotiations atmosphere, if any, between the parties. And then we really hope that this time there will be at least some participation from the local Serbs that would at least be the first step of, not just their integration in the Kosovo system, but also, establishing the association, which cannot be done without them on board. For Kosovo, like in Kosovo, there were like two narratives. The first one was that, well, we finally did it. Logistically, it was okay. I mean, it wasn't a problem. We managed to organize elections. But then the second one, and obviously, being, triumphalist in this regard, saying that we are finally, kind of acting in the north. But then the second one is complaining about Serbia, and rightly so, for interfering in the election. So there are two different narratives. The one that, we can actually do it with local Serbs without Serbia, which is, what Kurti wanted to do, but obviously failing. And the second one is the worrying signs from Serbia that even after Kurti agreeing to the association and starting to meet deadlines in Ohrid, agreed in Ohrid, there's still no political will. There is still, this will to challenge Kosovo institutions and authority in the north. And this, basically brings the biggest, problem out there, the problem of, Kosovo being obsessed with extending authority in the north, and Serbia, basically using everything to the contrary, and keeping the tensions on hold. And so the elections temporarily fill the vacuum, formally, the institutional vacuum, but this is not a long-term solution. I don't know how this is going to contribute positively to even establishing the association or like helping the negotiations to then further progress. But this is a splash of cold water for the EU, and Viola can talk more about it, on how difficult it is even after Ohrid, after using all the leverage that the EU had to actually make a breakthrough. How these agreements that are come from top down and imposed are not sustainable without having political will on the ground to actually make progress. So this is my initial point, and then I would like to move to Viola and compare 20% to 3.5% of turnout, 2013 and 2023. A lot has happened in 10 years, and apparently not good things. So I'll just, give the floor to you, and hoping that Marta now has managed to make it work.
Yes, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, and I'm very sorry. I don't know, I'm not sure exactly what happened today here in my home, but somehow I got disconnected from the internet, and I didn't have any cellular reception, nothing, but it seems to be working now, and I very much apologize for this, for these technical issues. I guess at some point it was bound to happen, but it's actually the worst timing, and I apologize to our audience. I apologize to our speakers who very kindly offered their time and expertise on this debate. And again, and I'm so thankful to the three of you for stepping up to the plate, and thank you, Donika, for also stepping up to the plate of starting and kicking off the discussion. So I guess I will take over from now, but as you said, I guess you gave the floor to Viola, and I apologize, but I couldn't hear your what I'm sure was very much your interesting statements on this and your reactions, but we look forward to hearing from Viola as well. Thank you again.
No, thanks, Marta, and thanks to the EPC for organizing and hosting this very timely debate. We had the opportunity to not to observe these elections on the ground, but rather from outside, and of course watched very carefully what happened on Sunday and before and afterwards. And Marta, maybe can you mute yourself? And of course, in the end, it was, as it was expected, rather sad. It was a very low turnout. There was huge pressure from Belgrade, from the north. There was an intimidation, especially for the Serbs in the north, not to participate, not to go to vote. And obviously, They try now to put pressure on the government in Pristina to come up with a, let's say, more reasonable proposal on the ASM. I think we should not interlink everything with everything, and I wished we could have seen a first, let's say, move from Belgrade and from the Serbs after Ohrid was achieved to move forward, to go forward and to participate in these local elections. I don't see that it is a help for anyone not to return to the institutions in the north. If you take this Ohrid agreement seriously, and if you have really an interest in the normalization of the relations, it is not enough to wait every time that somebody else does the first step and that somebody else comes up with something, and that the EU will put more pressure on Kosovo with the formation of ASM or organization of local government. I think it would have been perfectly fine at least to participate and not to boycott and not to intimidate your own people, your own voters in the way Belgrade did this. And then even more so to blame the EU, to blame us, to blame those who criticized this intimidation and the pressure coming from Belgrade, and to really show your true face. I think it was rather very much telling what happened during the last days online, but also in real terms. On the, let's say, good side, we have not seen any serious incidents. So it was calm, it was quiet. Yes, it was boycotted, but there was also no provocation on the ground. That is true. But when you hear comments from the Prime Minister in Belgrade calling it the last European ghetto and things like that, I guess this is absolutely unacceptable. This is complete over the top. It doesn't help anyone, and it just fuels in this hatred debate what I thought we had overcome after the last negotiations. So I thought that both sides finally have an interest to move a bit forward and to see also these municipal elections as one, let's say, integral part of that mutual interest in this next step in this normalization. So what we have seen on the Kosovo side, that at least the visa liberalization decision is done, it is through, it is ratified, it is sealed. And now from the 1st January on 2024, each and every citizens of Kosovo can finally travel, not directly to Madrid, but to each and every member state of the European Union. I think this is, it's long overdue. People in Kosovo had waited too long, but at least there's something. Yesterday, we saw the decision on the application for the Council of Europe. That is also important. I think there was a big, let's say, uncertainty whether this would be put on the agenda or not, at least last week when we were together in Strasbourg. But now this is also done, and it was by a large majority voted to agree on this application. That is an important move for the next, let's say, institution for Kosovo to be accepted in. But I think, for me at least, the elections, that was definitely a missed opportunity, and we can go in more details in the next round.
Thank you, Viola, very much. I actually, before I give the floor to Ian, I have just a follow-up question to what you've said. Do you think that now the window of opportunity created by this new momentum and this EU proposal for normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina is now closing with the events that happened and that led to these local elections?
No, not at all. But I think it could have been much smoother if you consider that Kosovo has the visa lib, and now with a let's say more successful and more active and more cooperative approach in the in the local elections, I think it would have been much easier to put pressure on Kosovo government to move forward with the ASM, with the boycott, with the intimidation, with us being threatened by the Serbian side with this hate speech, and that actually is a fallback, and this can be used then by Pristina, by the Kosovo government, by Kurti, by others who negotiate to say, hey, you see, this is the real face of Belgrade. Why should we move forward? We will just get this reply. And that is, of course, and also they voted against the application in the Council of Europe. So everything which personally I thought we could have achieved in the Ohrid agreement, it was kind of violated in the last days. But I don't think that this disturbs Miroslav Lajčák or anyone else here in Brussels to move forward and to see that each and every milestone will be achieved. I think they have composed the negotiation team or the management monitoring teams and so on. So the first steps are being done, and I hope the next one will follow.
Thank you very much, Viola and Ian. What is your take on the significance of these elections, both locally, regionally, and internationally? And maybe you could react as well to what has been said.
Of course, no, happily. I think, the elections and the recent developments of the last 6, 12, 18 months, I mean, they really reiterate the need to establish the association or community. This is the essential body for the reintegration of Kosovo Serbs. I think it's very easy to forget the progress that had been made up until about 2018. Judges, prosecutors were integrated, obviously the police earlier. Civil protection was disbanded. There was a lot of progress, and the vehicle of integration, the reason people came to vote in 2013, Serbs in the north and elsewhere, was because of Srpska Lista. It was a vehicle for integration of those terms that were agreed in the Brussels Agreement now a decade ago. And I think part of unlocking this question about the association involves challenging some of the narratives that have formed around it. It's not a new Republika Srpska. The Constitutional Court says some very specific things in its 2015 verdict, but it also says that it needs to be established. I think if we understand the association as a mechanism that completes the integration of the Kosovo Serb community, including the disbandment of those institutions, health, education, that are still funded by the Republic of Serbia, then we see this as a mechanism that extends Kosovo's sovereignty into various domains where at present it has no sovereignty. And if we go back to a situation of pre-2013, we're going to have a situation in the north where the Kosovo institutions, the municipalities, exist purely and simply on paper, and the parallel institutions are re-emboldened. The functionality will continue to be provided by the Republic of Serbia. And that integration process will be stifled even further. I understand the concerns about the association. I think they're legitimate, but I think they need to be addressed head on. As I said, I don't think these narratives about a new Republika Srpska are particularly useful. I think it's important that we consider what sort of safeguards could be built in to ensure representation and participation from non-Serbs who reside in those particular municipalities. But as I said, without this association, we're not going to see reintegration. And reintegration of the police is absolutely vital to diffusing the security situation in the north. You can see if you travel, on the main road from Pristina to Leposavić, you can see the concrete erections, the concrete chicanes, the barriers, the floodlights that have been installed. These are police with long-barreled weapons, tactical gear. Many don't speak Serbian, which is no fault of their own. They weren't trained to do this sort of policing. They're trained to do special operations as and when required. And until that, the reintegration of, policing is about consent. This is borne out in Northern Ireland in particular with the police reform. And until there is the return of Kosovo Serbs, and this is going to require a great deal of pragmatism on the part of Pristina as well, as and when we reach an agreement on the association. Ideally, there would be an automatic resumption of the services of those Kosovo Serb police officers who were integrated previously, and a simultaneous drawing down of special operations units. Because the situation in the north is not normal, and it's not been normal since, for a good 18 months now. So, we need to see progress on the association. And I'm afraid we're probably going to have to see these elections be rerun. You know, because as I said, the alternative is that the institutions exist purely and simply on paper. Now the elected mayors can go and can go and take residence in the municipal buildings and proclaim that they're acting, but you know, fundamentally, we'll see a complete fundamental stalemate in the pausing of integration. So I think, you know, the only way we're going to see the benefits of this recent agreement, Brussels, Ohrid, etc., is to see some progress on the association. Now, this is not an agreement that has come about because we had confidence building measures. On the contrary, this is an agreement that's come about in a climate where we've had barricades, where we've had the deployment of special operations units, where we've had, you know, the sort of rhetoric that Viola and Donika pointed to in their introductions. This agreement has come about at, you know, one of the worst points for relations between Belgrade and Pristina, more importantly, within and between communities in Kosovo, those who are on the front line and living this reality every day. So the international community is going to need to step in. The monitoring, you know, what I like about this deal is that it has a monitoring committee that overlooks implementation, and we need to see what sort of teeth that monitoring committee has. You know, there's supposed to be a new, you know, a new set of incentives, you know, new money that will come on stream. Obviously, the EU perspective is very important. I mean, you know, there's a sense in Brussels, you know, I was there at the end of January, there was a sense in Brussels that there's so much enthusiasm in Brussels around EU enlargement. Go to Pristina, go to Belgrade, go to Sarajevo, and try and feel that enthusiasm. You won't find it anywhere. And these are not easy questions to resolve. And at some juncture, if we get this association, then I truly believe that we can get beyond the crisis management that has come to monopolize how we talk about Kosovo-Serbia issues. And we can move to trying to restore trust. You know, some of you might recall the extent of cooperation between the chambers of commerce back in 2018. We had Kosovo businesses coming to Belgrade, being greeted by President Vucic and talking, you know, trade opportunities. You know, these things don't exist anymore. We really have gone back a long way since 2018. And if we're not careful, we'll go back to pre-2013 reality. So it's a pessimistic note, but I see some scope where we can try to be a little bit more optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I just have a follow-up question with regards to the suggestion and the proposal that you, apologies, that you suggested that the elections should be rerun. Under what scenario do you think that could happen in the short to medium term? I mean, these elections took place, and I think the international, well, some countries have already recognized that while they expressed regret at the very severe low turnout in the elections, they have, I think, recognized the elections as well. So how do you see that happening in the short to medium term?
No, look, I mean, the elections were run within, you know, in accordance with the Kosovo legal framework. They were sensibly postponed for a later juncture. They could have been held towards the end of last year. And on the day, they were well managed given the context. But I think if we look at what the purpose of the elections are, which is to elect, you know, legitimate local community representatives, then the reality dictates that they have to be rerun, because otherwise we'll have incumbents who sit there for 4 years and won't be able to achieve anything.
Exactly.
You know, their legitimacy is very weak, and for the reasons that Viola outlined. You know, people were intimidated into not running, intimidation into not voting, and the reality is 13 Serbs turned out. And I think the problem with this process, and it's been the way since 2013 as well, is trying to get the pieces to fall into the right order. You know, if we can get the association, then I think other pieces can fall into place. And that is the challenge.
Thank you. Donika, following up on this issue on the formation or the establishment of the Association of Serb Majority Municipalities, how do you think it could look like to satisfy both parties' demands? How do you see this working and functioning?
If someone has the answer to that question, can you please, you know, go forward and help Lajcak's team, but also Kosovo and Serbia to actually get it done? I mean, this is probably the most, you know, like difficult question to answer. But obviously there are, like there is a constitutional court decision which, at least in Kosovo, provides a solid basis for a starting point. And this is something that I have been saying for like so long. And this is something that Kosovo should take ownership fully and start, at least drafting a statute that would at least, not violate the spirit of the constitution. And be careful how to navigate around the points that the Constitutional Court of Kosovo considered to have been problematic. To go back, I will go back to this question, but first, like this is very problematic because, I mean, obviously we have institutions, but these institutions have mayors that do not reflect the actual political attitude of the local Serbs. And this is problematic because at the point when we were expecting for the Ohrid agreement to actually take off, we are violating the agreement signed in 2013, the Brussels agreement, because obviously that foresaw that this dismantling of the parallel institutions and integration of the local Serbs in Kosovo institutions. So what we're having with these elections is basically institutions run by either other minorities or Albanians. And then we are definitely going to see a stronger parallel institutions, meaning municipalities, but also like community policing is being done by people in the north who basically just are functioning probably and most likely paid by the government of Serbia. And then we will see like a lot more Serbian presence in the north than it was before. So this brings me to the point of the fact that we have lost the local Serbs, even those who were not satisfied with Vucic and could have been a solid sort of starting point to work with, we have lost them. And there was a good window of opportunity when Kurti and Osmani came to power, because they were considered progressive, young, and forward-looking leaders. And this is, basically what they basically have been considered not just by local Serbs, but also by us. And then seeing, them fall into this stabilitocracy trap of Vucic, using the north and the consecutive crises, tensions, interventions in the north, which became even more, sensitive after the war in Ukraine, to set up the negotiation positioning and mirror Vucic's behavior. This, lost them, because there was, some material that we could have worked with, and Kurti government had a plan, and the plan was talk to the local Serbs, economic integration, and so on. But none of that happened. So Kurti now is going against his, sort of key principle in the dialogue, which was, I don't talk to Vucic about local Serbs, I talk to local Serbs. But then, kind of finding out that it's very difficult to actually talk to local Serbs without Vucic, because this, his influence is deeply structured in the northern part of Kosovo, and is very problematic. So now what we see, instead of having a plan on how to implement the Ohrid agreement, or sanctioning against at least frowned upon behavior of Serbia in these elections, we just see like an EU that is kind of satisfied that nobody was killed during the elections, or there were no tensions, but like there is no progress either. There is regress, because now we are having like institutions that are probably most likely not going to function. So this is, my biggest concern about these elections. And then, how do you do this? How do you do association without, the local Serbs actually serving as mayors in, these 4 municipalities? And this, basically strengthens Vucic's game in the negotiations, which is drag on as long as you can, because the EU and the US do not have stamina to continue or to invest a lot of time in this, because they are hundreds of issues ongoing which require, and Ukraine is one of them, but there are other issues as well. So what Vucic wants is, to drag feet. Now, what Kurti is doing is trying to implement this Ohrid, annex, which is disappointing, if you ask me, because it has only one deadline, and the deadline is for the money, not for the actual implementation of anything. So why didn't they talk in Ohrid about this? Obviously, this is a political issue. This is not a logistical issue. North is not a logistical issue. It's not operational. It's political. It has to be discussed among the parties, and it had to be done in Ohrid. As a starting point, you want the association, yes, but then there are elections that are pressing, and let's do the elections first, because we need to integrate you in order to shape what you want to serve to your community. Instead, now Vucic controls this, and Jan, is right. We cannot continue with these results and these mayors and these institutions for 4 years. It has to be redone. But when Vucic is satisfied with whatever that Pristina will come on the 2nd of May, or later, at a later stage, with something that will look like a draft statute. So if Vucic is not happy with it, it means that he can prolong the process as much as he wants. But if he doesn't get sanctioned for this, then, we will just see another 10 years of negotiations under very bad circumstances. So, this is the problem that I have. It's long term. It's not what happened in the elections, but implications in the long run, which is, probably something that will, regardless of, because there is pressure on Kurti, and he obviously, is more flexible now towards the association. But now, basically is just keep on dragging feet as long as we can, as long as, we can blackmail the EU and the US with the stability card, which brings me to the point of tensions. Because if you have a security vacuum, rule of law vacuum, if you have no institutions, then, there is a risk of tensions. And these, tensions can obviously be used by both parties to strengthen their negotiation position in Brussels. And this is a very, very grim future for local Serbs, which we basically lost. Vucic is keeping them by blackmailing them, or even, paying, because obviously they do depend on the salaries, especially in, health and education and all, as we know. But, honestly, it's not that Kosovo is doing much. And we're just looking at it as, okay, as long as we just pretend that there is something there going on, then, we are more successful than the previous government. So it's kind of, feeding this kind of nationalist and polarization and, narrative internally. So then, the future does not look as bright as we saw. And obviously, these were the red flags we had when Brussels and Ohrid took place, but we didn't see it coming immediately after. I mean, I talked to Viola and I was like, okay, probably this is a good momentum, but not, to fail immediately, because then we had the Council of Europe, which Serbia can easily go with, oh, well, I'm not gonna support it. It doesn't mean that I violated point 4, because I am not either, sort of engaging in blocking it, like I did with Interpol or UNESCO. So now it's just, in terms of my vote, I mean, similarly, also Spain said no, and also Hungary said no. So it's just, kind of, it is easy to tweak and to not implement agreements that are ambiguous. And this is the price we are paying for having an ambiguous agreement in 2013 and making the same mistake 10 years later and not learning a single lesson. On a very pessimistic note, I end this part of my intervention. But yeah, this is the situation, and it doesn't look happy for a person who has been monitoring, working actively since 2013 to making this a success. And seeing all this shattering in front of our eyes is just, it's frustrating. I mean, the least to say.
Thank you very much, Donika. And I would like to bring in Viola and then also perhaps get her reaction to this rather pessimistic perspective shared by Donika. And also, do you think there's enough focus on resolving the sticking points from the international community's perspective? And also picking up on what Donika's just mentioned, under the current climate, what do you believe are now both parties' prospects for EU accession? Considering
it's very much dependent on their own progress and on their own commitment, on their own political will, how they really start to implement this step-by-step approach. I mean, yes, I think when you ask for attention, I think the international attention hasn't been so much on those both countries and on the dialogue in particular for the last years. I think the resumption of the dialogue had made everyone very much aware, and you saw that shuttle diplomacy was very active from different capitals, from Washington, from London, from everywhere. But also, of course, Russia in a very negative way played also into this from the Serbian side. But I think from our side, from the Western side, there was a huge interest to put pressure on different interlocutors in Belgrade and Pristina to come forward with a more constructive attitude. So that won't last forever. And I'm a bit concerned about the next elections in Washington and the next presidential elections. If one might imagine that the next president comes from a Trump camp, whoever this might be, they will not continue, and they have no interest in solving this dialogue in a way which we have now started. They will not support the European Union and different member states in their endeavor to put rule of law and other more merit-based process to an end. So I think the EU actually did a good job during the last month. I wish we could have been, much more advanced and much more successful. I think that in the end, it looked and offered as if nobody was ready then to sign and to come up with a compromise. So, I mean, Donika's criticism is absolutely right, but there was a decision without having anything, or a rather vague, broad and general agreement. And I think it was good at least to decide not just to come up with empty hands and to say, hey, good for meeting, but we will we will finish this dialogue process because nobody's ready to give in, not even a single inch. So I think the compromise is less than we had hoped for, no question, but this should not be the end, but rather the start. So different to what I maybe thought a year ago when we were only occupied by micromanagement, by crisis management, by working as a fire engine, as a fire brigade. I think, and I hope that we now have a more midterm or long-term perspective. Whether this does become real, I don't know. I've spoken to someone very high in the hierarchy here yesterday in the EU Commission, who told me very openly, I mean, Ukraine does extremely well when it comes to reforms, all the packages, implementation. They really speak with one united voice. They really want to achieve something. They really work so hard, even under war conditions and under war circumstances. And obviously, there is a comparison with the situation in the Western Balkan, where you see not this, let's say, engagement pro-EU. And Ian has said, yeah, look around, is there an enthusiasm? No, it's not. Is it only because we have disappointed people, or is it also because it's rather comfortable in this situation when you get a certain amount of money, but you do not really have to comply with the criteria, do not have to implement the reforms? I think all the external factors, such as the demographic, migration, and so on, would actually make the interlocutors and the governments make them work, because time is not on their side. And the situation with foreign interference from Russia, from China, but also, I mean, the migration factor will not make it easier for them to keep also the level of social of growth up as they could realize in the last years. But absolutely right. I think we need to keep up the pressure, and I hope we can jointly do this together with Washington and our interlocutors. But it needs also this commitment from the governments on the ground. And what we have seen in the last weeks after Ohrid was rather the opposite, was rather disappointing, was rather not complying and blaming always the others for not delivering. And then I think this is definitely not sufficient. So I think there needs to be, at least for putting pressure on Serbia, we have to keep up this pressure.
Thank you very much, Viola. I wonder, Ian, if you could come in and also react to what has just been said. I mean, you mentioned the lack of enthusiasm felt on the ground, which very much differs from this very enthusiastic rhetoric that you see in Brussels around enlargement, and of course that's Viola just mentioned. It's not just because the EU has disappointed people. I mean, do you see that commitment on the ground?
The commitment to the EU accession process.
Yes.
Quite frankly, no. I think Viola made an important point about, we need to see reforms. We can be the biggest advocates for the Western Balkans, but if we don't start seeing change. But it's very easy, of course, for politicians in the region to say that the EU doesn't want us. And that's certainly been a feeling in Kosovo because of how visa liberalization was handled. You fulfill all the conditions. There were more conditions than previously. You fulfill them all. And then for political reasons of certain member states, you don't see progress. And so it's very difficult to make, if I was a politician in the Balkans, would I bet my political capital and take risks to reform for a promise of the future? No way. I would probably act in the same way. I'm not going to pretend that that I would think differently if I was a calculating politician. And I don't know how we resolve that, because it's not easy to, even if there is enthusiasm in rhetorical enthusiasm about the future of the European project. And I think, many in Europe have been impressed with the way that Europe has handled Ukraine and the pandemic and post-Brexit, etc. And there's more conviction about Europe. You see the surveys across Europe about, do you want to leave the EU? And the numbers are, down. The Italians don't flirt with it anymore. The far right in the Netherlands doesn't flirt with it. They still flirt with it, but they have very little influence. Those voices have been marginalized by the effectiveness of the EU in responding to crises. But that doesn't translate into a necessary enthusiasm for an enlarged Europe anytime soon. And I think that's implicit within this deal. It doesn't talk about recognition. Recognition is going to come later on when both get closer to membership of the EU. There's no signature, but the Chapter 35 will be amended to acknowledge that Serbia's responsibility is to implement the agreement. But of course, if there's no EU perspective, then there's no glue behind this agreement. There might be some new money put on the table that might incentivize, but that remains to be seen. And so, it's very difficult to translate any sentiment, positive sentiment, support, advocacy into a tangible sense that there is progress. The demographic driver is a big one, is a big consideration. But if you're sitting in Belgrade, people will talk to you about how they had record foreign direct investment last year. $4 billion or euros. Dollars and euros are almost the same thing these days. So there are different different considerations. People in Belgrade think that that in certain circles that economically it's moving forward on a certain front. And I think some of the damage to the EU project from the financial crisis was that loss of sense that it's your only path to prosperity. And I think the EU needs to demonstrate that again. It needs to demonstrate that if you want convergence of your incomes, you need to come closer to the Union, and that's an argument that has been undermined a little bit, diluted a little bit in the past decade or so. So as I said, the difficulties of dealing with certain individual member states along the way. I mean, if you talk to interlocutors from the Ministry of European Integration in Belgrade, they're waiting for the next, for Croatia to introduce a new condition, for the Bulgarians to introduce a new condition. They wonder, where within the Union the next obstacle will lurk. That's not to say that they're genuinely, reforming and wanting to move down that path as quickly as possible. But I think there's a sense that there are just obstacles out there, just lots and lots of obstacles that, the EU leaderships at whatever level, certain member states or within the Commission or within the EAS have to try and, make sure that those don't act as impediments. Even on the visa liberalization, the Spaniards have said they won't recognize Kosovo travel documents. That there are European member states who are diverging from what we think is a shared position, but in fact it's not. I await the brave Kosovars who find themselves in Madrid and post selfies with their Kosovo passports and then get arrested by the Spanish police. I mean, it's, there isn't even a consensus on acceptance of travel documentation, which is something that Serbia even, conceded to in the Brussels and Ohrid agreements. So we don't even get that within EU member states. And this is an enormous hurdle, and we're not even talking about, will any of the non-recognizers be influenced by this deal? It's not a conversation. And I think Viola probably 12 months ago would have thought that if we had and maybe Donika as well, if we had a normalization deal or a step towards normalization, we'd be talking about one of the non-recognizers moving at the same time, and persuading people in Pristina that, the pathway is more open than it probably appears. But nobody's talking about the Greeks, or I don't think seriously anyway. I don't think the deal has done anything to unlock that big impediment. So we wait another decade. We see if there's progress towards the EU. If there is, then maybe we can get to a juncture where talk about some form of recognition, legally binding, will be possible. But at this juncture, we have, we have a deal that is imperfect in many senses. And we're waiting to see how the monitoring works, whether it has teeth. I don't think the implementation of the deal has really even begun yet in one sense. When we look, I think maybe I'm placing too much hope on the association, that unlocking the association will open up a path of progress, but remains to be seen. I think there are other dimensions of the deal that we need to talk about as well. There's scope for so many. We're letting this dialogue monopolize our conversations about relations between Kosovo and Serbia. One section of the agreement is about deals about cooperation agreements in other domains. We need to see more cooperation between universities, between businesses, on environmental issues, on rivers, on human trafficking, etc. And try and find ways where we can, build that underlying trust and confidence within and between communities, so that we might be able to improve the environment in which we're talking about these issues. I think just one more key point.
I just want to,
please.
Sorry. No, I wanted to bring in our audience because there are some questions as well. And I know that Viola has to leave soonish. So
no, let's go to questions. Okay.
Yes. There's a question from David Oik for all speakers. Do you see any concrete role for civil society organizations in the implementation of the Ohrid Agreement? If yes, what would that be? I think I would give the floor to Viola first because I know she has to leave soon.
Well, I think that what Donika said and Ian has expressed similarly. We need the civil society for all the implementation step. And on the Kosovo side, it's clearly to make sure it is in the interest of the entire society to implement this ASM, whether you call it ASM or any different structure, but it is not just something which Kosovo does because Brussels is behind that, but because it is in the interest to move them the next step forward with to bring the Kosovo Serbs back into the institution, to integrate them into your state, into the institutions, but also to move forward towards the EU perspective. Talking to representative of the government, they're very much reluctant. They really don't want. They really want to gain time. They have no appetite whatsoever. And to overcome this, we have to create, I would say, a more friendly environment within Kosovo, to have more tolerance. While you know, of course, that VB was never a friend of anything. Kurti was elected under actually the condition for not creating an ASM and so on. So for them, it is a big step. But I think many of the Kosovo citizens, maybe not all of the voters, are very much aware that this is a condition and this is necessary. And that is their commitment they have to do. But on the Belgrade side, yes, I wish we could also have a more outspoken civil society in favor of accepting the sovereignty and the statehood of Kosovo, for keeping Vucic accountable, all the articles which are mentioned to protect the territorial integrity of the statehood, to accept the documents, to ask the non-recognizer, as Ian has said, to not to go below what was agreed in the Ohrid agreement and so on, to really create this room for discourse in the society would be great, and also maybe to encourage the European Union for more youth exchange, for more civil society exchange, to really bring people a bit more together. I think the polarizing situation has rather increased than decreased in the last month.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Viola. Thank you very much for participating in this debate. I know you need to leave soon, but we're going to stay with Ian and Donika just for a little while longer so that we have enough time to address these two last questions from Berta. Which impact does the Kosovo-Serbia dispute have in the security and stability in the broader region? And how will the non-resolution impact the credibility and leverage of the EU in the region? Indeed, we haven't touched on this subject of the wider regional security and stability. So perhaps, Donika, you wanna start first?
Yeah, sorry, I'm keeping it muted because my neighbor is doing some reconstruction and I don't want to disturb the audience. Before I go there, I mean, it is very important that David has, posed this question on civil society, because this is something that we need. I mean, Jan has this project, and has tried to work quite a lot, but, he can tell you how difficult it is now to actually have something meaningful on track 2, be it either civil society or business, or academia, because of the depolarization that is on the ground, that is political. I mean, what happened, which I consider very sad, is the fact that since Lajčák took over, especially after this, depolarization between the US and the EU during a Trump administration, and how everything was managed, Lajčák somehow managed to kill track 2 and track 3 in the dialogue, which is very sad for the EU. It is sad because the EU has the money, the EU has the presence, and the EU could have done way much more in, supporting track 2 and track 3 in order to create a sustainable track 1 and successful track 1 negotiation process. Because you need to work with, people. You need to work with people that aren't, political elites who basically every move that they make calculate politically, and, in the next elections, which in the Balkans are, happening almost every 2 years, especially in Serbia. You basically see Vucic sort of, announcing the new government by giving it, like a 2-year time frame. So you can see, that everything is calculated precisely politically. So what the EU could have done is that work with civil society, support more all these projects, which they started doing in 2020. I was part of a project in 2019, which had its mission of promoting the technical phase of the dialogue, 2011, 2013. So it was like almost a decade later. That was something that, frustrated me, because it could have been done earlier to really, tell people what are the actual benefits of engaging in the dialogue and how a situation in which both parties could have normal relations could have benefited to the countries, to the region, and then to the integration process. So this is something that the EU has to sort of try to redesign, to work with communities, to work with academia, civil society, but also like try to sort of invest in projects that are, joint projects between Kosovo and Serbia, because every time you organize even festivals with people from Kosovo going to Serbia, you see protests in the street, which really shows how difficult it is to actually organize joint events, unless it's something, a panel discussion, which we sort of have been doing every now and then, and it's still sustaining. So this is, like task number one. What Lajčák and Borel are doing is that they are like, oh, let's close these men in one room and make sure that they agree on something and we don't care what's happening afterwards. This is wrong. I mean, yes, work with political elite, but, you have to work on other tracks as well. Second one is, how it's a circus. I mean, you have basically Spain saying no to Kosovo documents because they don't recognize the passport, but then having Borel, who goes on Twitter and takes pride on how he actually, convinced Serbia to recognize Kosovo's passport. And, he took pride on the IDs and the passport, but then, the EU does not even have leverage enough to actually sit and say, like, look, like there is Taiwan. And, like you're accepting Taiwan, then, if the same rules apply, then maybe Kosovo citizens can travel to Spain. But if you cannot do this, then, it's problematic. And this is something that, obviously the agreement of Ohrid and Brussels did not address. Which brings me to the point of EU leverage in the region, but what EU is in relation to this negotiation. Since the beginning, we saw an EU really wanting to show ambition in foreign policy and security and conflict management. They started with Kosovo, Serbia, and, like everything went wrong internally, not really having a unified voice against towards, Kosovo, at least in the dialogue, to make sure that, they are politically committed to something that is going to not only change the region, but also the role of the EU globally. And then obviously you have a persistent issue like Kosovo, Serbia, which is keeping the region on hold. I mean, there is a dispute that is requesting the investment, political, financial, and a lot of energy of the EU to actually deal with it. So, but having the EU engaging in this stabilitocracy cycle in which they close their eyes towards Vucic and everything that is happening in Serbia, also in Kosovo, and traded it with the stability, I mean, it really created a bad example for the other countries in the region. We constantly see either internally or towards each other, countries in the region try to play the stability card with the EU, as long as it keeps the EU away from the reforms that they have to do. So this is very problematic. And this is something that I said, and I meant when I said, for 10 years, we didn't learn a single lesson. And this is one of them. And I don't see it. I mean, I agree with Jan. I mean, what I see in the future is just a long negotiating process ahead of us, in which our starting point is really bad. Because back in 2013, we actually believed, or 11, we believed that the EU can shepherd the countries towards solving the dispute, and the EU integration carrot was somehow there. There was some democratic resilience. Now we are having an EU that is ready to trade everything for stability, to partner with Vucic and not really bother about it. And then you have like a situation on the ground, which is basically not good at all. And then you don't have the golden carrot, which is, the enlargement. So all these elements make all, the situation now, negotiation or chances for an actual breakthrough and success, very, very limited.
Thank you, Donika. Yeah, in fact, if you don't have a peaceful coexistence between the two peoples, you won't achieve much of a security and stability in the region as well. And I wonder, Ian, if you can also respond to the question posed by our audience regarding the impact of the Belgrade-Pristina dispute in the wider region and the regional stability and security. And also whether, I believe the question was also whether the failure to resolve this dispute would also continuously hurt EU's credibility in the region.
Just very quickly on the civil society point, I think, civil society has an important symbolic role to play, normalizing the fact that there can be relations between Serbs and Albanians, between communities, etc. I think that's quite important. I think civil society, though, has to go through, just to counter Viola's point, I think there are organizations in Belgrade who speak up in support of Kosovo. The problem is they don't have voice, they don't have influence. And just to, referring to Donika's last point, I mean, there is no opposition party in Kosovo, in Serbia that you will find who has what you call a more progressive stance on Kosovo. There's no liberal democratic faction like there was a decade ago. So the political reality is very difficult, and it leaves very little space for civil society voices. There's a bit of a crisis in civil society in that sense, I think, in terms of what role can be played and what constructive role can be played. But I think it's dangerous to let the dialogue process monopolize how civil society conceives its role. I think there are other dynamics and other processes, other people-to-people engagement that can have a positive impact aside from what is going on in Brussels or Ohrid. On the regional point, I mean, obviously it does have an impact. Particularly the divisive rhetoric that comes out of, in particular, tabloids in Belgrade. Several times in the last 18 months or so, we've had the Serbian armed forces put on a state of alert, and that, in the context of what is happening in Ukraine, reawakens very painful memories of war that is only 2-3 decades, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance. We're focusing here on Kosovo and Serbia today, but Dodik's rhetoric about state property, about the interentity boundary line, and ultimately about secession has been has been building upon secessionist rhetoric over the last 18 months or so, about pulling out of the judiciary, about challenging the sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So next door in the region there is arguably an even more fundamental problem in terms of the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So clearly, one problem is Kosovo-Serbia issue, I think, absorbs so much energy in Brussels. It gets so much focus. It gets so much, so many resources and so much thinking and so much, political capital is put towards this issue, to the neglect of other issues. So there is that sort of, indirect impact of not having the sort of requisite bandwidth to simultaneously deal with the problems that are engulfing Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, obviously at this juncture, it's very difficult for people in Brussels to understand why, vehicle license plates become an issue that, possibly lead to confrontation and require the deployment of more European security assets. And so I fear there is at this juncture of where Europe is and what is happening in the East, there is a preference to trying to keep a lid on things. And I don't think the temptations for this, stabilocracy are going away. I don't think they're going to, if we're hoping that, I get the long-term argument that if the stabilocracy ultimately leads to an unstable situation. But I think, in this juncture, there's not going to be a great temptation to have, to try and, pursue some fundamental reforms in the political spheres of either Serbia or Bosnia Herzegovina, etc. It's going to be a very conservative, very cautious approach, and that's what we see with this deal. It's very much grounded in what is possible at this juncture, or what is perceived to be possible at this juncture. It doesn't even try to go beyond, any further down the path of tackling the reconciliation question. And so it leaves a lot of questions unanswered, and leaves a lot of things uncertain. But it does that because it's a very sort of inherently conservative deal, which those of us who want something more ambitious will be very disappointed by. It's no surprise when if you follow Lajčák on Twitter, he spends more time going around EU member states than he does actually dealing with the interlocutors in the region. And that is because there is the constant need to make sure that member states are engaged in the region, that they have their eyes turned towards the region, that they realize that this is Europe's backyard. And there are questions about credibility and leverage, and arguably there's fundamental damage that has been done to those things already. I'm sure Donika could talk for the next 2 hours about conditionality and does it actually exist anymore? And with the way that Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, how they've all, in a sense, moved forward quite dramatically on the accession path. These are political decisions. We're back to having a discussion about a political process, whereas at the same time, those purists of EU accession want to retreat back into the conditionality question. Let's turn it into a completely technical exercise where we can carefully monitor the progress, and we can do nice diagrams and graphs, and we can use traffic light systems, and we can create some competition and pretend that this is like a high school competition to be top of the class. I mean, people sitting in governments in the respective capitals don't feel this way. They feel if they lobby, they barter, they threaten, they create a situation whereby this is why it's been an old tactic in Belgrade, even during the Tadic years. If you don't deal with us, you'll have to deal with somebody far more radical. It's a constant implicit threat that we are the sane, rational, logical, pragmatic voices that you're speaking with. And this works in European capitals because the Balkans is not the most important issue. It's arguably not even in the top 20, top 30. I mean, there are fundamental problems that still afflict I complimented the EU in its response to various challenges in the previous years, but who knows? We could have another refugee crisis, on the doorstep. We could have another financial crisis on the doorstep. We have war already in Ukraine that is, again, absorbing, huge amounts of resources and time and effort. And so, the Balkans, has to try and fight its corner, but yet at the same time has to be realistic about where it stands on the list of priorities. And I think that's a challenge. And, we could take this conversation another way and talk about things like Open Balkan, and do we see these, domestically led initiatives as being complementary to the process of EU integration or not? Where do we see, if we lose the glue of EU accession, what do we see as the alternative processes or incentives that can drive politics in the region? But maybe that's too pessimistic, because I think none of us feel comfortable talking about the region without having an EU perspective. If you go to the Caucasus, until recently, there was no EU perspective, and therefore, if you were talking about peace building or reconciliation, you had to find different ways of building relationships within and between people and politicians and communities. Maybe we should get used to talking about the region, even hypothetically, I suppose, even if we did these as mental exercises, imagining the Balkans without an EU perspective. It might help sharpen a little bit of the analysis. I think sometimes it's too easy just to fall back and say, oh, well, there'll be an EU light at the end of the tunnel, and eventually we'll get there. Talk to people who've worked on Cyprus, and they'll warn you that, if you told them 30, 40 years ago they'd still be working on Cyprus, they would have been petrified. But this is a very real prospect if you're dealing with Kosovo Serbia issues. You could be dealing with it until retirement. I think we touched upon several of the EU credibility points, but as long as there are non-recognizers, I don't think there's going to be a way out of this. And I don't see. Viola said that, voices in, Spain's not going to be swayed by voices in Belgrade advocating for recognition of Kosovo's independence. It is something that I think is not going to happen until we reach a juncture where Serbia moves first. And so it's going to be one of those structural factors that we just have to accept whilst we try to work out how relations between Serbia and Kosovo can be. I think the one slightly, let's say, perverse optimism is I think things can change quite quickly, partly because a lot of this is politically orchestrated at times. As I said, Srpska Lista once upon a time acted as a very effective vehicle of integration, and there's no reason why it can't do so again. So, My only source of optimism would be the ability for things to change very quickly and for the better. But as I said, getting the pieces of the jigsaw or the dominoes to line up in the right order is a challenge.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both Ian and Donika. Very, very grateful for your insights and your participation in this discussion today. Indeed, I hope we can leave this discussion with a slightly more of a positive note and not leave the discussion with such a pessimistic view of what is likely to happen in the next couple of months, years, in the medium in the short to medium term. I think very much the focus should be on a step-by-step approach, first focusing on let's have some progress on the establishment and the creation of, or at least resolving differences regarding the competences of the Association of Serb majority municipalities, work on perhaps changing the narratives, having more political will, more grassroots support. But again, as you all mentioned in the section that we've discussed, the role of civil society. Indeed, this is key, because without civil society support, there's really no solution in sight.
I think we have one more question. Andre.
Okay.
He had his hand up, his electronic hand.
Oh, okay. So Tatiana, if you can, before I close this discussion, the session, if you can give the floor to Andre de Munter, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, apologies to Ian. I still owe you a couple of replies to emails. You know what I'm talking about? Yes, I mean, you mentioned Bosnia-Herzegovina. My focus is currently on Bosnia-Herzegovina and Turkey. You can imagine the combination of both drives me quite mad, not to talk about our interparliamentary cooperation. I have to say I completely agree with the level of pessimism of Donika's analysis. For me, it is sufficient already to look at the footage, the few seconds of footage we get whenever there is a meeting between Lajčák, with or without Borrell, and Vucic and Kurti. I mean, this says it all. With these two, nothing can really happen in terms of chemistry or whatever. I mean, this is just a remark. And Ian knows from his meeting he had with me when he came with his group with me and some colleagues a couple of months ago, that I'm certainly not part of those who are so optimistic about enlargement and prospects in the near future. Maybe because we tend to seize every opportunity to meet people from the ground, which is absolutely necessary to do a good job. I would have a specific question on the monitoring committee that was mentioned by you, Ian. As far as I know, it would consist of 3 people, like Lajčák, Petar Petković, which is already a bit problematic, like you are going to monitor yourself, even if you execute the orders of your political boss, and then the ambassador Bayrami. The composition of this monitoring committee to me is another indication of the absolute lack of creativity. And I would, I wonder whether the monitoring committee would remain restricted to just these 3 people. That would basically be my question. And as Donika was unfolding her pessimistic scenarios, I was increasingly starting to understand why in the title maybe we don't have Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, but dispute. So thank you very much. If you could comment on the monitoring committee and your ideas, or how you would see it, or any additional information on that. And thank you very much for taking the question, Marta.
Thank you.
I mean, we all like writing our own performance evaluations. So look, I mean, I think Donika touched upon it. This is a very carefully stage managed process. If you're looking for a rigorous objective monitoring committee, I don't think you'll find one. Maybe you could advocate for some MEPs to be part of it. But I think this is about, I'm not trying to induce any cynicism from the outset, but there will be a temptation to project progress where those on the ground might not see a great deal. And of course, the question will be how will it attribute responsibility? Once upon a time, Kosovo and Serbia used to publish their own progress reports about the dialogue, and they were wonderful. I mean, they were different ends of the spectrum. We did this, they didn't do that. They're to blame for this, and they didn't do that. I mean, and I suspect that we're going to end up in a very similar dynamic here. And then the question is then about monitoring. What are your mechanisms if someone is in violation or is not pursuing implementation? Often, having worked on dialogue, I mean, often things don't move forward, not because of ill intent, just because things don't fall into place. I mean, budget allocations don't get made in time, or it's very difficult to decipher sometimes where an obstacle is really because of a lack of administrative capacity or a failure to plan effectively, or where it's actually being used for political purposes. So the real question then is, what happens when one party is deemed not to have implemented its obligations? I mean, the problem is with even financial incentives. Money that goes into capital projects, you can't just recycle it at short notice. These are multi-year commitments that you make. So there might be new money that comes on tap. As there was in the north of Kosovo, there was new money that was brought on tap, and it didn't have the desired effect. The EU cancelled a big £5 million, I think, project to construct, €5 million project to construct a cultural centre or a university building, and it had no effect locally. So my question really would be, the composition is one thing, of course, but what are the mechanisms that can be used when determinations are made about, and how public is that going to be? Is there going to be a simple, 4 or 5 paragraph release after a meeting of the monitoring committee, and then separate briefings by Pekovic and Bayrami? I mean, I think we all see there the recipe for, competing interpretations. And as I said, the problem we have, because we haven't had a process that's been built upon confidence building, we need to build trust in this process, because there isn't any. And maybe that's another role for civil society, I don't know, but there is no trust in this process. We haven't gone through a confidence building process, whereby the parties have met frequently at the high level and, instinctively have a feel for one another. We're working in a context where everybody's deeply cynical and deeply skeptical and, ready to attribute blame as and when. So I really fear that I think it's good that there's a monitoring committee. Maybe there should be a shadow monitoring committee. Maybe that's the answer.
And maybe this shadow monitoring committee would just be from civil society and will work on, based on really the reports, but just taking everything like the other way around. No, I mean, honestly, I cannot imagine this discussion ending on positive note if we talk specifically about this. It's like completely, yeah. I mean, it's problematic. I think it's a good exercise in terms of, like giving ownership to the parties, because obviously the EU had, this dialogue, this process is since the beginning, it has very problematic ownership issues. The EU says the process is not mine, it's of the parties, and the parties say like, oh, we are, sort of in this process because we need integration and we kind of, have to do it. So like no one actually took full ownership of what happened. And also like all these agreements, almost all have been externally driven agreements pushed by the EU. So like parties would never actually took full responsibility for drafting them. And sometimes not even for agreeing to them. They were like, okay, I was pressured, I had to do it. So that's, like kind of implementation, it doesn't even like, they don't even envisage how that's going to happen, because, like the leverage of the EU ended with the signing of the agreement, like the Brussels agreement. You sign it and then you agree to it and they will, give you something in return. So like never was like, not even the EU actually was serious about the actual implementation. And obviously the parties weren't. So, this is an exercise to give ownership. I'm not sure what this, Commission will do. I mean, it's good for both Kosovo and Serbia to publish reports based on the annex, signed in Ohrid, and like really, sort of provide an update to what is happening on the ground. But I mean, where is this commission when we have the elections in the north, or like Serbia in the Council of Europe? So, like it's very problematic to basically see where the sanctions are. And this then boils down to the other problem that I forgot to mention. The EU leverage is money. And that's not leverage anymore in the Balkans. Unfortunately, it's not, because money is coming also from illiberal, actors. So the EU has the money, obviously, and it comes, like from good channels. And this is something that I would definitely support as opposed to, but then there is Chinese money, Gulf countries, some Russian money, some, so like you have other actors who are willing to give money for an exchange of like an easier process without, any control. So the thing is that, yes, you establish this commission, then even if the commission is like the most objective commission ever, and then they would, even, like mention their own flaws in the process and the implementation, where are the sanctions, who sanctions, and what are these sanctions? And this is very problematic. In the case of Kosovo, we are seeing some rewards. I mean, obviously there is engagement in the dialogue, you see visas moving, you see also like the Council of Europe, like, a process that is kind of taking shape. So you see like little carrots, but then in Serbia there is money, and, like money without democratic sustainability, without rule of law, like obviously it goes in the wrong hands. So it's very problematic. So it's not as much as whether the commission exists, or does the work, is who sanctions, what are the sanctions, and are they going to be immediate? So we see that it is happening for real.
Thank you. Thank you both, Donika and Ian. I think despite the note of pessimism, this has been a really interesting and fascinating conversation, and your insights have been very, very important. I would like to say that we will, first of all, also apologize to our audience and to our speakers, to our guest speakers, for the technical hurdles. And thank you so much, Donika, for stepping up to the plate. And
you can always invite me to Moderator events.
Exactly. For sure. So thank you very much. And as I was saying, we will continue to closely monitor the Belgrade-Pristina normalization process. I won't refer to it as dispute, as well as regional developments in the Western Balkans. So stay tuned to our future initiatives. We look forward to welcoming you all in our future events. And thank you again to our speakers, to our audience, and have a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.